Thank you very much, Shlomo. We have already 3 words, Prainsack, Boniolo, and Lander, but if I may ask you a question. The risk of depersonalization of doctor-patient relationship that you talk about once individualized medical data are introduced into personal care of each patient. Could it be avoided or reduced if we apply it to personalized medicine intended as stratified medicine as presented in the morning?
Oh, sorry. I said perhaps as philosophers tend to do, I take the more extreme scenario and present that as a certain, red line and try to envision. This is really, like we all imagine, I mean, this is totally futuristic. So I'm taking some kind of worst case possible scenario of a very futuristic personalized medicine and use that because there it is easiest to put the finger on some problems that, that may arise. They may turn out to be very small problems, but maybe they may turn out under some circumstances to be bigger problems. We'll just be better off if we're prepared for them. That's all. And I agree, the more it's stratified and less revolutionary, I said in the beginning, the more these worries may become trivial. I agree.
Is this for both speakers or for Shlomo only? Okay. So thank you to both speakers very much. I think the talk spoke to each other in interesting ways. Thank you for this very much needed intervention. Your talk focused very much, and for good reasons, on genetic and genomic technologies and their uptake in the clinic. I would like to sort of bang on the drum that I banged yesterday, in the sense that there's processes and practices of personalization include other types of digital data, and I think especially also in the global south, we need to think about that, because every global health meeting that I go to celebrates the digital revolution, especially for countries, and here I just quote, that don't have resilient infrastructures, that have very rudimentary healthcare systems, and digital data is going to compensate for part of that. And I think there are genuine good intentions behind this, partly, but partly there are also clear strategies of creating new markets and so-called emerging market customers that can then be sold services to, and also to use people in the global south to draw data from them, to draw conclusions for the global north. So I think there's a new social division emerging between data givers and data takers that corresponds a little bit with the global north and the global south. This is why I think we need to talk about digital health also in the context of personalization all over the world, and not only in rich countries and contexts. And for Shlomo, and I'll keep this brief, I think it was really, really important that you didn't just bracket off trust and say we need more of that, blah, 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 but that you opened the black box of what trust means, and I think the link to intimacy is very important. So I think there are very interesting discussions going on at the moment of how to deal with the problems that you outlined. Our group has recommended that we should think of the introduction of a new profession, which we call health information counselors, but there are other approaches that go in a similar direction. And I think that it's quite interesting, and this is just an observation, that the Topol review in the NHS that looked at how digital health impacted on clinical roles was very different from what you would expect Eric Topol to say. You know, the person who wrote a book called The Patient Will See You Now, and who predicted that 80% of all problems will be diagnosed with digital tools, actually said in this review, not he alone, but with his team, we need more time for doctors to talk to patients. We need more time for doctors to train and educate themselves, not only in genetic literacy, but also algorithmic literacy, computational thinking, those kinds of things. So it really, there's a shift going on from this idea that the algorithm will regulate and do everything towards saying humans who use digital aids. Digital aids will not replace humans in the clinic, but humans who use digital aids will replace those that don't. And digital aids are here to facilitate high touch and not the other way around. So I think there are very interesting, partly contradictory developments going on that pull in different directions.
Please ask you to be brief, because there are several people that wish to ask questions.
Yes. My question would have been, what do you think of precision public health? But that's the end. Thank you. Sorry that I...
Yeah, thank you for your comment. I planned my talk poorly. So some of the things that you're talking about, I did not get time to say. What I'm talking about is not throwing out, the technology, and it's already there in medicine. But the point that I'm making is, and I think that came out a little bit in Dr. Cohen's also, I think genetic research, understanding the human genome are very important. But I see them as providing additional tools. But if you look at the hype, and there's been hype even in this room about, what genetic medicine can do, I think that is the issue that is problematic for me. As far as, the north to south and how we can do things, that would be beneficial, to the south with some of this stuff. And there are areas where you can use communication, out in rural areas, etc. But the problem is right now, and this is something that has come out, that human genome, it's still uncharted territory. It's just beginning to be explored. And the hype about it is tremendous. From my experience, when you have advances in medicine and new technological stuff and research, the issue is how much of that, the benefits of that, will flow through to countries, the developing countries. The track record is not good. And therefore, in something like genetic research, which is an extremely expensive proposition, I may be proven wrong, but I'm not very optimistic based on my experience of 25 years working in Pakistan. So, but these are things we should be talking about. But I am not that optimistic as you are.
A question for Shlomo. Shlomo, I think that you touched a very important issue concerning trust. I think that probably you are more optimistic and from a certain point of view more pessimistic than me. You are more optimistic about the possibility to have automated diagnosis. That is, you know that there are been a lot of attempts to construct software based on evidence-based medicine in order to have an electronic diagnosis. But as far as I know, at least in Italy, we do not have any hospital in which you enter, you give your electronic records, and they put inside a computer, and they give you the prognosis and the diagnosis. So as far as I know, we are very far from this. We could imagine that maybe in 100 years, but there is a problem that the software, all the automated software, They are, of course, extremely powerful, but they are made by men or women, and they have the same limits of the men, of the women that they construct. So many times we forget that we think that software or something, algorithm or something in the sort of Plato's third world, actually they are made by men. So from the point of view of trust, you are perfectly right. That is, the sequencing technologies, the imaging technologies has changed a lot the structure of the relations between the patient and the physician. But this is something pretty common in the history of medicine. That is, all advance has changed the structure of the relationship between the patient and the doctor. 3 centuries ago, if you had the need of a surgery or a surgical operation, you went to the barber. Now the barber just shave. If you had a cancer 30 years ago, you went to the hospital, you had only the clinical oncologist. Now you have a tumor board. A tumor board is made by a clinical oncologist, by a pharmacologist, by a radiologist, by a molecular pathologist, and so on, so forth. So really, we have a decrease concerning the trust relation. Anytime we speak about trust concerning a physician, we have to take into account 2 different kinds of trust. The trust in the physician, qua man or qua woman, and it is the same trust that I can have with my friend, with my father, with my brother, that is, I hope, in honesty, in loyalty, so on and so forth. But there is a second kind of trust that sometimes we forget. It is the trust that we have in him or in her, or in the team as the role that they have. And in this case, there is a third party that guarantees the role. That is, as it happened, that is, when you have just one physician in front of you, you trust him as a man or her as a man or as a woman, but him or her as a physician. And this kind of trust is guaranteed by a third party. That is, by the institution that trained that particular man or woman to be a physician. And the same kind of third-party authority, a third party that guarantees the role, is given now with precision medicine. There is a third party that guarantees that a tumor board composed by different expertise allow you something. So nothing changed from this point of view, but it is a different kind of, there is no different kind of trust. Trust on the man or the woman, and trust on the role. Because many times we forget that the role is trusted, not only the physician who performs the role. In this case, we do not trust only in the physician, but in the board of the physician. So I wouldn't be so pessimistic as you.
Yeah, thank you. Just really, like in a couple of sentences, these are interesting points because trust is an interesting concept. It's an interesting form of relationships. It's multifaceted. It has perhaps language is misleading us in having one word for so many different types of human relationships. And that is true, and that is an interesting philosophical issue that I will not get into now. I agree with you. There are many different senses of trust. What I tried to say is that there are some elements, such as privacy, intimacy, wisdom, that are associated in certain ways with trust in general, and specifically with trust in physicians. And that there is a certain bidirectional relationship between the person and the institution and the institutional rules and so on within which the person functions. And it's true that, you know, the trust in the system of authorization of physicians, if it's high, then it reflects on how much trust you have in your physician. Such as I said, you know, very simple sense of trust imparted by a person who gives a sense of being trustworthy, reflects on the system. It's very complicated in that respect, but still, I think that there are some possible characteristics of a system that operates according to personalized medicine that could reflect on the kind of interaction that there would be between patient and doctor, and that's what I try to describe. Thank you.
So, Shlomo, two quick questions. First, thank you. It was very rich, lots and lots to think about in there. And I liked lots of it. But I'm going to give you a hard time about a few bits, because that's more fun. You speak about algorithms as the opposite of wisdom in these doctors. Seems maybe a bit romantic. How much wisdom the doctor actually has is an empirical question. Many doctors are mediocre. They don't actually know that much. Moreover, many algorithms democratize things. You think about retinal fundoscopy, where now a machine learning algorithm makes it accessible to people all over the world where there isn't a decent retinal fundoscopist, whether you're talking about India or Indiana. And so I just sort of note that this is an empirical question, how often that wisdom serves the patient better or not. And I appreciate it'll go either way, but I tweak you on the grounds that there's an element of romanticism in there. The second point is your critique of the doctors spending all their time at the screen because they're hung up with their computer and all that. Yes, of course, but maybe there's an element of, my goodness, cell phones are so huge from the 1980s, and you have to lug them around. And of course, the people who make these things know that they're terrible, these systems. But the folks who are thinking about the real systems they want to make, imagine voice recognition systems that are listening in on the conversation and processing that information and able to pop up at the end with things you might have missed as the doctor. And so are you giving a critique that's essential to the problem, or are you just critiquing the current ergonomics of the product?
Right, thank you. With respect to wisdom, maybe it's a bit romantic, but there is a serious point that we often conflate intelligence and wisdom, or knowledge and wisdom. They are very different things. A person can be very intelligent and yet lack a lot of wisdom. We meet a lot of these people in the academia. No, it's simply because it's a good place to meet these people, because there are lots of very intelligent people, and so you can see that not everyone who's intelligent is necessarily wise.
Say present company excluded, I think.
I'm supposed to say present company excluded. Thank you for the British island. Thanks. I need to have a British counselor for manners next to me. That is very good, because I'm from Israel, and we suck at that. Thank you. Sorry. So when I spoke about wisdom, my intention, given what I just said now, was to put the finger more on the art aspect of medicine. And in that respect, again, I was adumbrating an extreme scenario in order to, because in the extreme scenarios, difficulties are seen better. And in that respect, if, as I said, in the extreme scenario, there will be less and less of natural histories of diseases, then there will be less place for the art form of having experienced natural courses of diseases with specific patients, and then having the sensibility of seeing the similarities between what you saw and this patient in front of you. So this is more the art aspect, and that was, it could be that I was a bit over-romantic, but that was the point. That was the point. And you're right about the question about, your second question had to do with whether the problem with the screens is anything essential or just something that has to do with the way things are done now. I'm aware of it. It may prove to be something that we will find easy solutions for. But I'm not certain, because it's not a problem in medicine only. It's a problem of getting to be a problem of the entire humanity, that our connection to screens comes at the expense of some interpersonal capacities that time will tell to what extent they will harm society in some significant way, or perhaps not. There will just be a little, a challenge that we will overcome. Well, I don't know, but I think it's an interesting question with respect to society in general, and not only the doctor-patient relationship is a sub-cosmos of this. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
We have now Perlmutter, von Braun, and Riordan, and afterward Wilson, Hood, and Fins, and Austin.
Shlomo, I will sharpen the comments that Eric made just a little bit in the following historical context. For at least the last 50 years, the challenge in academic medicine has been to deal with this problem of expertise in the medical community. And that is that really responding to the question, do doctors deserve our trust anyway? At the time when the objective medical record was introduced by Steve Wheat about 50 years ago, doctors objected to the idea that they would have to list out patients' chief complaints and the response to those complaints, because it took away from the art of medicine, which to me was a mask for actual lack of knowledge and understanding. And so often when we talk about those things, when we talk about wisdom, what we're actually talking about is the ability to convince. Because it is well known that patients much prefer actors masquerading as doctors to the doctors themselves. They're far better able to convince and are seen as being more experienced and more wise. So the big problem that we have faced in medicine for some time is that physicians generally don't know what they're doing. And they practice medicine in a way that is very non-standard from one region to another. And as we began to explore this, we realized that it was necessary to have some evidence in the form of outcomes to understand whether or not what was being done was actually benefiting the patient. That has been the state of progress for the last 50 years. And we continue on that road now because we have better ways of measuring things. Inevitably, there is disruption of this doctor-patient relationship, but I think all to the good. And I close by mentioning an old joke about the American playwright S.J. Perelman, a comic and a confirmed hypochondriac. And a well-meaning friend said, I know a doctor who you should see, enormously wise, and really loves the theater, knows a great deal about literature. And he said, I don't want a doctor who knows about literature, I want a doctor who knows about medicine.
We will
keep the order of speakers, but I want to say a few words, use the prerogative of my chair, to try and open up the discussion for the other talks that we have been experiencing in the morning, not to mention yesterday. Now, I will say now a few words. We'll go to Dr. Austin. There are actually, it seems, two ways of presenting health and disease. The one way is the continuous one that we heard from Dr. Austin. So whether it's diabetes and coronary artery disease and these extremely rare diseases shown, there's the whole continuum. The only difference is the prevalence. And he has shown us a few challenges. But there could be a binary way of looking at things that I may read from Dr. Hood's model, and he would say 95, most of humanity is basically healthy or normal, whatever you want to say about this. And personalized medicine or precision medicine is to look at them as systems and help them avoid accidents that we call diseases, no matter what's the accident. And there are indeed a few humans that have very serious particular problems that deserve attention, and maybe the we medicine is that the majority that follow the kind of P4 program take care of the minority. And the me, we, it could be we towards the other, not necessarily towards myself. And then it goes from Professor Austin, we might think that we are dealing here with a need for medicine or drug or intervention. It's not necessarily medicine for every disease, and this is an impossible task, and we need to step up. But from Hood, we might think in the lines of when I studied traditional Chinese medicine for smaller armamentum of drugs or interventions. They do not, we have representative with the drug industry, but whatever intervention. And the combination may vary. Like we have 22 letters, in Hebrew at least, and we can create endless combinations. And the last point to ask about, again with the model, we have some people who, like the elephant man, who needed tailors coming and tailor a suit that he wouldn't go about naked. But for most of us, we buy our suits as stock made in shops, and sometimes we need the fine tuning. And here, the trust with the doctor, and this but may be more specified for fine tuning sometimes, or the doctor judgment will apply at the range of human reasoning, and you get some help fine tuning with machines that listen and give you the point. So we can see different ways of looking at these things, not in the two extremes, although there is indeed a metaphysical questions of science here, whether we look at a continuum here or system medicine for a range of systems that we consider principally healthy and a minority that have very serious defects in them. And they are all humans, but the medical approach should be quite different. And now we go back to the order of speakers, but I hope you to rethink into what you say, issues either related to what I tried to say or to the other talks we have had so far.
Cohen perhaps wanted to address Perlmutter.
Yeah, I'll repeat that. I identify with what you say. The sense of romanticism that I understood, that I expressed, is not precisely what I intended. I'm thinking about the optimum. The optimum is to use many algorithms, but at the same time, not to lose something else that algorithms cannot give, such as having a good sense of the fact that a patient wanted to say something but didn't, and to solicit it. And there's no algorithm that says that, or that the patient right now needs, I don't know, a hand on his shoulder, and many other things. My point was not that there's anything that we should go back to medieval medicine or to medicine that was 50 years ago, not at all, but only that in an ideal medical world that will incorporate much probably of insights or techniques of personalized medicine, that we don't lose something else in that steamrolling advancement. That was my point.
Von Braun and Reardon afterward.
I address my question or comment mainly to Dr. Moazzam, but maybe Christopher Austin can also comment. What needs to happen so that personalized or precision medicine is not by the rich for the rich? What concepts would you, from your perspective, put on the table? I'm roaming around quite a bit in India, Bangladesh, and also have doctoral students from Pakistan. So against that background, I see the problems which you pointed out, but I also see the opportunities for leapfrogging into technologies with frugal technological solutions, including in health diagnostics. Can there be opportunities related to precision medicine supporting what you called person-centered medicine? Are there examples? And most fundamentally, how can research and applied research partnership between the developing world and the non-developing world, to use it like that, the rich and the poorer world, constructed so that such leapfrogging might happen?
Yeah, those are important questions, but they're difficult questions, which is how do we proceed? I think the basic, one of the basic issues that I see is increasingly medicine is, like a lot of things, medicine and science has become less inclusive. I go to a lot of conferences, whether they're on ethics or they're related to, for example, organ transplantation, etc. So we have the science and it's beneficial, but that part of the world, you say you've traveled there, few people do this, even in conferences, and I'm not being critical, but if you look at this conference, there is one representative from that part of the world. So I think we can learn a great deal from each other, but if the primary drive is essentially going to be technological, technology can provide us a lot of tools, and it already is. I mean, we're using it. CT scanners, some of the other modes that have come to us from the West. So your question as to what would be the solution, it's a difficult question, because what I have found in the last 2 or 3 decades, that this separation is increasing rather than, that's what the world is going to. So I think it's more of the reason I used the elephant thing was that I think a more inclusionary approach, I can't give you one solution, so you will excuse me, but we have to be more inclusionary. This is the time in this world where as I said, we're building walls and fences, and those are not just concrete things. How we go about it is perhaps more forums like this, but forums that are not just in Italy, but forums of this kind within some of the countries you have mentioned, because that is how you get a few other people touching that elephant and letting you know what it is. So that's kind of a relatively vague answer, but I think, yes, it's something we need to do. And if I can take this opportunity, Dr. Cohen, you don't have to be apologetic about having this romantic aspect within medicine. Medicine is not an exact science. It never will be. It's not possible because we're dealing with humans that are more than molecular compositions and genes. Those are important to know. I wouldn't apologize for that. I wouldn't be apologetic at all.
A short comment. We had invited an expert on the projects in personalized medicine in China and Southeast Asia, and she canceled, unfortunately. And Professor Gracia has been teaching, and he knows Latin America and the Spanish-speaking world in general. So it's very difficult. We have not chosen people to represent, although it's important the background varies, but we have done the best to have a diversity of backgrounds and acquaintances. Thank you.
Let me just say a couple things about that. The first is that though we do tend to talk about the U.S. as a unitary being, of course it isn't. And we have populations in the U.S. who live very much like the people in Pakistan in general. And so there's an acute realization of these dynamics even within the U.S. And so the All of Us program from the very beginning actually is designed to oversample the populations who are the have-nots, traditionally have-nots. So about 75% of the people who are being recruited into that program are minority populations or health disparity populations, either ethnically, geographically, et cetera. So we may have some insights into this, but that might help with other countries, and so we're trying to tackle this just within our own country. The second is within this international rare disease consortium that I had the privilege to run for the last 3 years, we brought in developing world groups, including from Botswana and India and lots of other places, and they're of course acutely aware of this problem. And what came out of this was a very clear statement from them that they don't want scientific colonialism to happen. That what they want to be able to do is access the data and the approaches that are appropriate for their cultural context and leave the rest alone. And so our approach to that is more to present a menu of options from which they can choose. And we also made it very clear that we want to learn from them about how to integrate this more into a more holistic health system. I guess the last thing I would say about that is that, given everything that we're talking about today, in the last couple of days, it's not absolutely clear whether these approaches are an unalloyed success or a good. Forget about the expense. And so don't feel bad that you're not going whole hog into this, because there's some major questions in our minds. This is a research field from my point of view. And of course, remember that the United States is the country that brought you 20% of our GDP going to healthcare. So, which is 2 to 3x what every other country does. So, and our health statistics as well as anybody. They're no better than most countries in the world. So I guess it's a be careful what you wish for, on from that perspective too.
Your points are well taken, but the issue is, and I'm not blaming you or anybody else for it, but in this drive for moving into this, there's a parallel, and I'm sorry, I'm not bashing the United States, but when the United States, for example, has gone in, and I'm not talking medicine now, and removed a particular structure in a country without really seeing that there is no other structure, then it's just something that all of us need to be careful about. That's all.
Okay. Yeah. I think we're having a really important discussion here, talking about trust, which I think is intimately connected to the question of authority and the question of knowledge, and talking about questions about who we are, who are going to be a part of this world. And the opening discussion about romanticization made me wonder what romanticization actually means. And I'm going to actually ask whether or not the vision of democratization we've been talking about is actually romantic. It's very important to how we've talked about information. And so if there's something underlying personalized medicine that connects what Barbara was saying to genomics, it is the informatization of medicine. And information, you might recall, was that thing that was supposed to bring us all together. It was part of the end of millennial, the Cold War has ended and the borders are coming down, and we're going to remake the world through the World Wide Web. There's going to be the internet and the information. It's going to bring about this new democratized world. It was all part of the genomic revolution too. Genomics is fundamentally informatic, and it informaticized the body, and it made it easy for genome scientists to connect into that language of democracy, I think in a way that we have to actually question. I think what we mean by democracy, like just because I think we're seeing this with Facebook now, is sharing of information necessarily a good thing? Well, it depends on who gets access to it, what is done with it. The breast cancer, the folks who are trying to right now bring together post the decision in the United States, the Supreme Court decision that brought down the patent, that meant that Myriad no longer controls that breast cancer gene information. Now you see people trying to take back their breast cancer information and to put it into a collective themselves. And recently, they have found that Facebook is not keeping their information safe. And so now that whole effort has been thrown into question because there is an untrusted space for keeping the information. And we have a problem, which is that we don't know how to create a trusted space for information. Facebook, what's the alternative to Facebook? What's the alternative to personalized medicine? We're moving into a world where we cannot imagine alternatives. I think we are creating an unsustainable and dangerous world if we're doing that. So I think we need to be open to using that word romanticization carefully, because I think that when people bring up positions in this room, they're doing so for important reasons. And I think it would do us, well, and I think, we're having a good conversation here clarifying what we mean. And I think being open to those questions about what we mean by big words, like democracy, like trust, like information, is essential in going to Von Braun's question about what we ought to do. I think we do need to create trusted spaces that are more inclusive, although inclusion is a very difficult thing to achieve, partly because if the thing you're wanting to include people in is something people don't believe in or trust, they're not going to want to be included in it. So you often have a chicken and the egg problem, which is that you have to change the very thing that you want to include people in before you're going to get to more inclusion. But how do you do that without including people? So you're kind of stuck. And I say that from my own experience. You know, starting out as a geneticist, as someone who was sequencing DNA when it was still pouring hot liquid between two plates of glass, and I was, you know, very much encouraged to go on in the genome sciences. I received a National Science Foundation predoctoral fellowship to fund my whole career in that. I ultimately decided not to do it because I think I just didn't believe in it for reasons that we're talking about in this room, because I was always the lab clown that was asking the bigger questions. And I felt that a field of science that couldn't seriously ask big questions like, what is the gene? If you asked a question like, what is the gene? And you got told, oh, that's Jenny, she just asked those questions. That's not the space you want to create. So it may not sound very practical, but it needs to become practical, which is how do we make space for asking the big questions about meaning? And if you don't do that, you're going to go down a technical, determinist hole that you don't want to be in, and nor does the vast majority of the population. The 2/3 of the people who live, you know, in the developing world will be joined by the 99% who don't want to live in the world we're creating. So I think that's the importance of this meeting. I think it's really important that you know, an institution like the Vatican, which has values like being global, but like addressing values that aren't just merely technical or scientific, that it gets into this activity of discussing what the future of the world will be in a moment where science and medicine and technology are one of the few things that people are prepared sometimes to trust, which means that it's becoming very important to how people live their lives. And so, anyway, so this is my take on the big problem that we're having as we're discussing this. No question.
Thank you very much. We have now Wilson, Hood, and Finns.
I think I'll pass. It got asked already.
I'd like to return to my own personal view of what personalized medicine is. I think personalized medicine is assessing for each individual the trajectory of their health, following wellness and occasional transitions to disease, letting them deal with those more effectively, and maybe later in life, more irreversible transitions to disease. I think the really important point about wellness is it's not monolithic. There is an incredible spectrum of wellness. We define wellness by people who can walk around and appear normal, but when you look genetically, biochemically, you can see lots of differences. Now, you can go to the literature and assess these differences, and you can convert them into actionable possibilities that are pointed toward for each individual from the analysis of their personal data cloud, not an average data cloud. And every one of us will have a long list of actionable possibilities that can be used to move you from wherever you are on that wellness spectrum up to a more optimal level. The really key thing is we use big data, we use algorithms, but the algorithms point toward actionable possibilities that are easily understandable by coaches and by physicians. So the really critical point for wellness is how do we deliver the actionable possibilities to the clients? And we chose to take wellness coaches trained in psychology, trained in nutrition and diet and all of these other things, and they've been incredibly successful. 70% compliance with the actionable possibilities in very large populations, enormous trust established. And in many cases, the coaches actually work with the patient's physicians when we identify transitions into disease so they can manage the disease part of it. So it isn't algorithms that give you blindly do this. It's algorithms that point to actionable possibilities that you can go in the literature and read about. And I would argue exactly the same is with this deep knowledge system we've called consilience, where you can take a disease like Alzheimer's and you can convert it into 840 logical blocks that are hierarchically organized into which you can feed patients information and can come out in a form that you can put directly in your patient's medical record, diagnosis and therapy. And the system is open box. The physician can actually learn the logic that was used to come to the diagnosis and or to the therapy. And people will sometimes argue, getting back to wellness, well, it's just trivial. It's diet, it's exercise, it's sleep. It's much more than that. And I'll give a beautiful example. One of the major causes of a class of Alzheimer's is black mold that comes from roofs that have leaked, and people live in these houses for years. And we've actually seen several people who, when so diagnosed, you can remove it by moving them out of the home, and in 6 months they've lost the early signs of Alzheimer's and they've converted back to normal. So the point is, wellness cannot be diagnosed visually. It has to be diagnosed by looking at your biochemistry and your genetics and your omics and your all of these other things, but they are brought together in a way that is logical and physicians can understand it and learn from it. I think with this deep knowledge system we're developing, in the future, we'll be able to go out to Walla Walla, Washington, and have an individual there be utterly equivalent to an expert in Alzheimer's in terms of diagnosis and therapy and how it has to be done. So I would argue that these are very powerful adjuncts that could be exported to other countries as well. I would just leave with one warning sign. I'm a big fan of all the digital measurements. I will say there are a lot of things that digital instrumentation is not going to measure. So don't think the digital instrumentation can do everything that we need done.
I want to make a couple of points. First, I want to say something in favor of romanticism, and that is, what does romanticism actually bring you? And what romanticism that is this confidence that, I bet you're never going to use that word again without thinking about it. But confidence in the physician, well-placed or not, leads to the well-known phenomenon of the placebo effect. And what I and all of my colleagues who work in interventions to try to improve health consistently find is that actually the placebo effect is better than most of the interventions we have, more effective. So if you look at them side by side, and diabetes is just one great example. The placebo will give you about a 30% improvement, and an intervention, given intervention, will give you about a 20% intervention. It's what Schweitzer called this the doctor who resides within. And of course, that's dependent on competence in the doctor. So the point that Roger made about physicians not knowing what we're doing is absolutely correct. I mean, in my own field of neurology, it's well known that 90%, it's actually been published, 90% of what neurologists do, there's no data for.
Wouldn't actors be cheaper?
Yeah, it depends on who the actor is. Yeah, right, exactly. Right, so placebo. Yeah. Yeah, and it works for this reason, right?
Let's keep the order of speakers giving by the chair. At lunch, we do it fully.
Yeah.
Professor Fins, please.
But the second point is exactly what Lee said, that these algorithms are going to be used to enhance, not to replace. And so the role of either wisdom or judgment, whatever you want to call it, better remain. Those of you who followed what happened with the IBM Watson foray into cancer diagnosis will know that it was really important that there was an oncologist with a brain looking at those data, because the data that the algorithms spit out, at least at this point, were actually quite misleading. And the last thing to say is that, it's interesting to look at the question of when people get these data, do they actually change their behavior? And actually, there have been a number of studies shown that if you give people their genetic information, they actually, for the most part, do not change their behavior. And so we make a big deal of this, but it's not, and even when they do change the behavior, it's in rather trivial ways.
It depends how you give them the data.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's probably true. But in the consumer genomics sort of. And a friend of mine, a very eminent geneticist, who I won't tell you who it is because he would deny it probably if I told you that. He was one of the first people who went, and it's not Eric, by the way, or Roger, or anybody in this room, and he was very excited. He's going to go get his genome done, and so we asked him, so what did you do? It's the result of the recommendations. He said, I lost 15 pounds.
Now, Professor Fins, then I will say something, and we break for lunch, and we.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to reiterate a few of the things that have been said, but basically Shlomo's comments about we've lost the narrative, we've lost our authority, which Roger said we weren't ever really entitled to have. We were sort of imposters. We had the imposter syndrome, and now we're Wikipedia doctors drawing upon all this information. And I think this is a very valid criticism, and all of us who practice have seen the, as William Carlos Williams described it, the idiot with the stethoscope, right? So, but that neglects this other aspect of medical practice that I think is embodied by Picasso's famous painting, Scientia e Caritas, Science and Charity, which was interestingly produced the exact same year that Osler wrote his textbook of medicine in 1892. And I think there's a homology there. And I think to get to the issue of we will lose the knowledge of the narratives because we're all going to be different. But the commonality, the we, that Professor Dickinson is talking about, the we is the father who is pissed off about equipoise, as Chris pointed, whether or not their child has end-stage common disease or end-stage rare disease. It's the father grieving for a child. And in the Science and Charity painting, Picasso depicts a dying woman, a physician who was modeled by his father taking a pulse, and a nun under a crucifix holding a baby. And so I think what we have to really think about, even as doctors have to learn how to use these assistive devices, these algorithms, to make them better in translating knowledge, is a translational function, but there's also the priestly tradition of medicine. And I think it's important to remember that there was an Esculapion in the Isola Tiberis island just next door here. And this brings me to the other point about the we and the commonality. And this is not to return to medieval medicine at all in any respect. It's just to not forget that with the ascendance of scientific medicine, which was somewhat unjustified and premature, we lost this other priestly tradition. Finally, the other we that I want to mention, and it relates to Chris's talk and the comment about we, is that there is an institutional collective that is the we, that makes the me possible. And I was really taken by Chris's comments about the family that comes in, finds out their child has a very rare disease. They go online and they find the 15 other families that have that rare disease, and they develop a community. And that community is only possible because of the infrastructure of places like the NIH and informatics and Facebook that make it possible to search out and find a community. And so I think we need to, we have to celebrate that community. At the same time, I'm totally with Jenny about making sure that we understand how to regulate that information. One final point, and there was a great Catholic senator from New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a sociologist, and someone that I've done some writing about at the Library of Congress. I've gone through his papers and the like, and he describes intermediary cultural institutions that mediate the role of the citizen with the government. And he talks about, labor unions, churches, synagogues, civic organizations. And he was interestingly against the Clinton plan in the 90s because it would sort of change the professional workforce that he thought was essential to scientific advance. But I think what's important for us to remember is that the intermediary entity between big science and knowledge and the individual suffering patient, which means to suffer with compassion, to suffer with the patient, is the physician. So we have to make sure that the physician has the technical skills. They may look more like coaches in Eric Holder's, framework, Leroy's framework, and they're going to use the algorithms, but they're going to have to be different, and they're going to have to embody the ability to guide and the ability to comfort in tandem. And I think that would probably restore the physician to his or her rightful role, and we'd be less imposters, we'd acknowledge our ignorance, and we'd embrace the frailty that we share with our patients.
Thank you. One short word to conclude a comment when Leroy Hood spoke about showing the trajectory of One Health, ways of looking at it. And the best place in the world is here. That's related to the existential question, quo vadis? Because when St. Peter heard this, it was not about the trajectory of his health and about the deterioration of his risk factor for diabetes. It was about a different kind of questions about direction chosen. So what Lee Hood reminds us that we can always make these fundamental existential questions for ourselves and then rely on data from the cloud. But there is a risk, I think, at least people perceive, and people who peddle the instrument of medicine, that we might be get imprisoned in iron cages of health monitoring. That is not just one decision making, and we will see our ultimate questions, the quo vadis of each person, and by extension, the quo vadis of the person we care for, in terms of this iron cage. And one evidence-based example, we know, for example, from the Harvard Men studies, an old longitudinal study, that's why it's politically incorrect in the Harvard Men study, that the effect of caring for another needy person on one's healthcare is no less in magnitude than the detrimental effect of smoking, of the abuse of alcohol. It's easy to see how algorithms tell people, and people follow these particular advice like avoid sugary foods. But tell people go and care for somebody is less in our language, in our awareness, and how we might be able to implement it. And that points to think over lunch, when people care for us and serve us lunch, and we will convene right on time in 2 hours minus 6 minutes. Thank you.